Please welcome now the second speaker tonight, speaking for Leave. Please welcome the Labour MP Kate Hoey.
Thank you. Tony Benn called the EU a derogation of our historic democratic right to select and remove our governments. He was right then, he's right now. The Labour Party, as you know, was as a whole, when I joined it, was very sceptical towards the common market. And there are still some in Parliament today who were elected, including Jeremy Corbyn, on a manifesto of leaving the EU. I'm very proud to be following in the footsteps of great Labour figures whose democratic credentials can never be doubted. Hugh Gaitskell, Peter Shore, and people like Barbara Castle. The Labour movement's roots were to represent the interests of the workers against big business. The roots have shrunk. Then, if they have, and they are, then so has the true meaning of left-wing politics, and we need to refresh them. Preserving the right to elect our governments, who make the laws that we have to carry out, is the basic minimum of people's rights. It's the basis of all other rights, and without it, rights can easily be taken away. And I don't believe you can trust people in power if they cannot be removed by elections. Now, no one can deny that the EU's government, the Commission, is unelected and cannot be removed by any of us or elections. And that fact alone is reason to me enough to reject the EU, regardless of all the other considerations that you will hear tonight. If we were looking now into joining the EU as it is, if we were looking now to join it as it is, the vast majority of people would be absolutely horrified at its anti-democratic status. And I've been in the Labour Party for many years, and occasionally I've been known to disagree with my party's majority view. But I'm in the Labour Party because I care about our public services and the service that they provide to the most vulnerable. And the EU is going down a neoliberal path to open up those very services to global tax-dodging multinational corporations. Now, many people in my party think vaguely of the EU as some kind of social democracy. It isn't a socialist, it isn't democratic, it is exactly the opposite. It is corporatist and anti-democratic. And the EU's founding principles, the four principles of capitalism, the four principles, the four pillars of the EU, free movement of goods, services, labour and capital. And those are the principles of a free market. They are not the principles of a political system. And the EU's purpose is to rule in the interests of the smooth running of a corporatist economy without regard to the encumbrance of an electorate. Is this something that Labour voters or anyone else can support? José Barroso, president of the unelected Commission, made it very clear in 2014 the EU is an antidote to democratic government. You know, how can he actually even try to pretend that he trusts the sense or decisions of the people? Another reason many Labour voices support the EU is that they believe it somehow favours workers' interests. The so-called social chapter was offered to the unions in exchange for acceptance of the anti-democratic nature of the EU, and they fell for it. It offered regulations about working hours and holidays, which could easily have been achieved by democratic means and served most to create an acceptable image for the capitalist EU. This is perhaps the cleverest fraud of all. It does nothing of the kind. It seeks to make, out of the 450 million people, a vast sea of migrant labour, the biggest pool of migrant labour since the 1930s in America. Now migrant labourers are forced to work for a minimum wage and can be excluded from union rates by EU law, a good example being the Laval case in Sweden. The EU has even prosecuted unions for trying to get union rates for migrant workers. Why? Because they want to make cheap labour available right across Europe, despite the hardship and upheaval it creates. At least when we oppose, and I oppose, the policies of this Conservative government, we can actually look to voting them out and reverse their policies. We can't do that with an unelected EU Commission. And similarly on all the environmental issues, the EU, some people will say, is good for regulations of emissions, poisonous substances. Again, it's exactly the wrong impression. And this has been made very clear by the TTIP trade agreement negotiated in secret by the EU. Not only does it give the go-ahead to US corporations to sue governments for loss of profits, threaten the enforced privatisation of the NHS, and to impose GM foods despite British bans, and to make it impossible to regulate against harmful chemicals, it actually creates the legal conditions that undermine the very abilities of elected government to make laws in the interests of the people against the immense power of the multinationals. There could be no clearer indication simplification of what the EU really is, an attempt to replace the democratic power of the people with a permanent administration in the interests of very big business. Everything else is a smokescreen. And I cannot understand how anyone on the left who opposes TTIP would want to remain in the EU. And that's very clear why Obama was threatening us. People who know how dangerous the EU talk of reforming it from within. They know that that can never be reformed. The best way to secure our freedom and democracy in Europe is for the United Kingdom to leave the EU. And finally, for people who keep saying, what does leave look like? Well, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like all the other 169 countries in the world, most of them with true democratic accountability, free trade, border controls, and so on. So the question is, let us be clear, there is no certainty about remaining in the EU. The price of true freedom is uncertainty. The price of certainty is a form of servitude, and we need to set our country free from that future servitude.
Liz Hoey.